Hello, I'm Dan with the George Memorial Library, and today I'm out at the Morton Cemetery in Richmond, Texas. In November 1821, William Morton and 4 other men were sent in advance of Stephen F. Austin's colony, known as Austin's 0300. They built a fort in the bend of the Brazos River, in the area which eventually became known as the town of Richmond. The fort, also known as the Little Log Shanty, was built for shelter, a place to keep supplies, and for defense in case of Indian attack. Some believe that William Morton was the first person to make a settlement in the area. The actual fort was really just a 2-room cabin with a dog run going through the middle of it. There is a historical marker for the fort that is located in the Mirabeau v. Lamar Homestead Park and Archaeological Reserve. No one knows exactly where the actual fort was located, but it is estimated it's in the general area. And with the shifting of the river, it's now most likely in the middle of it. The photo here is a replica of the original fort that used to be located in Decker Park. The replica was in very poor condition and was eventually demolished. A Mexican land grant was issued in 1822 to William Morton. The Morton Cemetery was established as a Masonic cemetery in 1825. That same year, Robert Gillespie, a Scotsman who had resided in the United States for several years, traveled to Texas and found himself at the home of William Morton. He was ill and had no money. When Morton learned that he was a fellow Mason, he and his family cared for him until he died on November 7th of 1825. Morton buried Gillespie on his property, and since he was a bricklayer and stonemason, he built a monument over his grave. It included inscriptions and Masonic emblems on all 4 sides, and is believed to be the oldest Masonic marker in Texas. Before the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836, Santa Anna's army camped out in the cemetery. According to the monument that is there now, sometime during their stay, several Mexican soldiers attempted to destroy the monument, but were stopped by one of their officers who was also a Mason. The tomb deteriorated over the years, but was eventually restored by the Masonic Lodge in 1936 during the Texas Centennial. Later, in 1962, the monument was rebuilt. There are 2 similar-looking old Masonic monuments, but the names and symbols have been worn off over time. In 1833, the Brazos River flooded, and it is believed that William Morton died attempting to swim across the river. His body was never found, but a marker was still placed in the cemetery for him. His widow Nancy inherited the land and later sold it to Handy and Lusk, who eventually founded the town of Richmond in 1837. In 1854, land which included the cemetery was acquired by Michael Deschamps. Before then, several other people had been buried in the vicinity of the Gillespie grave. From 1897 to 1943, Morton Lodge owned and operated the cemetery. As time went on, more land was added to the growing cemetery. It later became known as Richmond Masonic Cemetery, or just Richmond Cemetery. On January 20th, 1944, the Richmond Cemetery Association received its charter from the state of Texas as a nonprofit corporation with the purpose of preserving and maintaining the cemetery. The new organization was named the Morton Cemetery Association. In the fall of 2008, an open-air chapel was added to Morton Cemetery. There was a dedication ceremony on November 7th, which marked the 183rd anniversary of the death of Robert Gillespie. And now I will talk about some notable Texans that are buried in Morton Cemetery. Jane Herbert Wilkinson Long was born on July 23, 1798 in Charles County, Maryland. Before she turned 1, her father had died. In 1811, her mother moved them to Mississippi Territory. In 1812, her mother died and Jane went to live with her older sister near Natchez, Tennessee. In early 1815, James Long, a physician, came to Natchez after his involvement in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. And by May of that year, James and Jane were married, and their first child was born in November of 1816. In 1820, they were at Bolivar Point, a peninsula opposite Galveston Island. They established an outpost in an effort to help free Texas from Spanish rule. In 1821, James left on an excursion while Jane was expecting their second child. She planned to wait at the fort until his return. James was captured and accidentally killed in Mexico City. Jane did not know of her husband's demise and remained at Bolivar Point through 1821 to 1822. As supplies dwindled, other inhabitants began leaving. She later reported that with her 12-year-old slave and 6-year-old daughter, she remained and gave the illusion that the fort was still protected by soldiers in order to keep the Native Americans in the area away. On December 21st, she gave birth to her second child. In the spring, a friend of her husband persuaded her to leave. By 1832, Long opened a successful hotel in Brazoria County and ran it for 5 years. It became a primary port for the newly arriving immigrants. In 1837, at age 39, she sold some of her land to Robert E. Handy, one of those who developed the town of Richmond, the county seat of Fort Bend. Jane opened another boarding house in Fort Bend County and also developed a plantation 2 miles south of town. She bought and sold land, raised cattle, and grew cotton, and by 1840 owned 12 slaves. She died on December 30th, 1880, at the home of her grandson, James E. Winston, and is buried in Morton Cemetery in Richmond. Family stories said that she had many suitors, including William Travis and Sam Houston, among others, but always refused them. Jane Long's gravestone is inscribed, Mrs. Jane H. Long, the Mother of Texas. Mirabeau B. Lamar was born August 16, 1798, in Louisville, Georgia. In the summer of 1835, he traveled to Texas, which was then part of Mexico, and decided to remain. October 2, 1835, the Texas Battle for Independence began. When he learned of the Battle of the Alamo and Goliad massacre, Lamar immediately joined Sam Houston's army in the spring of 1836. On the eve of the Battle of San Jacinto, April 21, 1836, Lamar courageously rescued 2 surrounded Texans, an act that drew a salute from the Mexican lines. Lamar was promoted that night from private to colonel and given command of the cavalry during the battle that following day. 10 days after the battle, having become Secretary of War in David G. Burnett's cabinet, he demanded that Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna be executed as a murderer. A month later, Lamar was a major general and commander-in-chief of the Texas Army, but the unruly troops refused to accept him, and he retired to civilian life. After Texas achieved independence from Mexico, Lamar was appointed as Secretary of War in the interim Texian government. In 1836, he was elected to the position of Vice President of Texas. On December 1, 1838, Lamar was elected as the second President of Texas. Several weeks later, in his first formal address to the Texas Congress, Lamar urged that the Cherokee and Comanche tribes be driven from their lands in Texas, even if the tribes had to be destroyed. Later, Lamar appointed a commission to select a permanent site for the capital of the Republic. They recommended Waterloo, which was later renamed Austin. Lamar has been called the father of Texas education because of his provision of land to support it. During his administration, he convinced the legislature to set aside 3 leagues of land in each county to be devoted to school development. He also allotted 50 leagues of land for the support of 2 universities, which later became Texas A&M in 1876 and the University of Texas in 1880. Although no facilities were constructed during his term, he provided the base for a statewide public school system. The government gave 18,000 acres of public land for public schools. He wanted education to be a priority to cultivate a knowledgeable citizenry. In keeping with other slave societies in the South, Texas prohibited free blacks from school. A public school system was not firmly established until after the American Civil War, when the Reconstruction-era legislature created an endowment to finance a school system. In 1869, Texas passed a law to give the public school fund the proceeds from sale of public lands. The Constitution of that year authorized the legislature to establish school districts and appoint directors. Freedmen's children were included in the system despite much opposition. Lamar left office in 1841, and Sam Houston was again elected as president of Texas. Lamar returned to service in the Army and fought in the Mexican-American War. After Texas became a state, he was elected to the Texas legislature and held office for several years. He died of a heart attack at his Richmond plantation on December 19, 1859. On August 9, 1840, Walter Moses Burton was born into slavery in North Carolina. He was brought to Texas around 1850 or 1860. His owner, Thomas Burton, had a plantation in Fort Bend County. He also taught Walter how to read and write, which was a huge benefit for him following the Civil War. After emancipation, Thomas Burton sold Walter several large plots of land for about $1,900. In today's dollars, that would be approximately $30,330. This made the freedman one of the wealthiest and most influential blacks in Fort Bend County. He became involved in Republican Party politics and served as president of the Fort Bend County Union League, founded in 1863, to support the policies of Abraham Lincoln after the Civil War. The League mobilized African American voters, and most African American legislatures were associated with the League. In 1869, he was elected as sheriff and tax collector in Fort Bend County. He was the first elected African American sheriff in the United States. In 1873, Burton campaigned and won a seat in the Texas Senate, where he served for 7 years, 1874 to 75, and 1876 to 1882. In the Senate, he championed the education of African Americans, and among the many bills he helped push through was one that called for the establishment of Prairie View Normal School, now Prairie View A&M University. He left the Senate in 1882, and upon the request of a white colleague, was given an ebony and gold cane for his service in the chamber. He remained active in state and local politics until his death in 1913. He and his son Horace, 1849 to 1895, were the only African Americans buried in Morton Cemetery for many decades. Hilmar G. Moore was a fifth-generation Texan born on July 20, 1920. He was a cattleman and the grandson of Texas Secretary of State John M. Moore. Hilmar served in World War II, and after his service, he returned to Richmond in January 1946, where he worked in the cattle business. On September 22, 1949, he was appointed mayor of the city of Richmond to fill an unexpired term. And after that, he won 32 consecutive elections for 2-year terms, and remained in that office until his death in 2012. He was the longest-serving mayor in U.S. history to date, at 63 years and 73 days. After his death, his wife, Evelyn, succeeded him. During segregation in the 1950s and 60s, Moore worked to persuade restaurants in Richmond to integrate. Hilmar was honored with a life-size statue in front of Richmond City Hall in October of 2008. Moore died on December 4th, 2012. Thank you for joining me for this tour of the Morton Cemetery in Richmond, Texas. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, feel free to let us know. And I'll see you next time around the bend.